"Sir,
Naomi, please,
can you
just
buy
listen
this
to me for a
medicine?
second.
My mother
I know how
won't
this
make it
looks,
through
but
the
you have to
night."
believe me, it
The
wasn't
words
like that.
left Naomi Ellison's mouth so quietly
Please, sir,
they
I
should
need
have
this
disappeared
prescription
into the
filled. I
hum
don't know
of the
what I'll do
refrigerator
otherwise.
and the soft clink of silverware
Your
from the
medical
dining
needs are
room
not my
beyond.
responsibility,
Instead,
Naomi.
they froze the entire marble kitchen. One of the chefs stopped plating dessert. The housekeeper near the pantry went still. Even the old clock
Naomi,
above the service
I know
door
this
seemed
looks
to hold
bad.
its breath.
I am
Grant
so
Holloway
sorry, but
stood
we
at the
need your
far
help.
end of the island in a
It's
black
urgent.
cashmere coat, one hand around a glass of amber liquor, the other resting beside his phone. He looked up slowly, his pale eyes landing on Naomi as if he had never really seen her before. Only the uniform, the tray, the polished silence she moved through his house with. In Naomi's hand was a wrinkled prescription slip, damp from the heat of her palm. Her fingers trembled, but her voice didn't. "I'll pay you back," she added, swallowing hard. "I just need her to last until morning." The room stayed silent, too silent, because everyone there understood what she had just risked. In a house like Holloway's, people like Naomi were meant to clean up pain, not bring their own into the light. Grant's jaw shifted once. The ice in his glass clicked softly as he tilted it, then set it down with deliberate care. What he said next didn't sound loud. It didn't need to. Cut anyway. And by the time Naomi stepped out into the cold night with that prescription still in her hand, the last bus already gone and rain beginning to fall. She had no idea that before midnight, the billionaire who had just turned his back on her would be standing at her door. Naomi Ellison had spent 3 years in Grant Holloway's house learning how to disappear. She knew which floorboards creaked near the west hallway, which crystal glasses belonged to guests who tipped and which belonged to guests who didn't, and exactly how long she could stand in a doorway before someone looked at her like she was taking up too much air. But the one thing she never got used to was leaving that mansion every night and stepping back into the life waiting for her on the other side of the city. Her apartment sat above a closed laundromat on a street where the streetlights buzzed louder than the traffic. The hallway always smelled faintly of bleach, mildew, and old radiator heat. Inside, the place was small enough that the kitchen table nearly touched the foot of the bed in the next room. But Naomi kept it clean, warm when she could, and quiet enough for her mother to sleep. Loretta Ellison hadn't worked in almost a year. The illness had started like a cough, then turned into fatigue, then something heavier, something that took her appetite, her strength, and little by little, her voice. Naomi had learned to read the room by sound now. If the coughing came sharp and dry, she could still manage it with steam and tea. If it turned wet and low in the chest, she knew they were in trouble. Tonight it had sounded worse than either. The kind of breathing that made Naomi stop whatever she was doing and count the seconds between each inhale. She had already called the pharmacy once during her dinner break. They wouldn't release the refill without payment. She had called again from the service stairwell after polishing silver. Same answer. She had checked the envelope taped beneath the sugar jar where she kept emergency cash and found $14 and some coins. The medicine cost $83. So she did what she had promised herself she would never do again. She asked. Not because she believed Grant Holloway was kind. Not because she thought rich men suddenly noticed women like her when they were hurting. But because she had run out of hours, run out of money, and run out of safe lies to tell her mother. Loretta still thought the delay was because the pharmacy had closed early. Naomi had smiled and said she'd get it after work. She had even tucked the blanket tighter around her mother's shoulders before leaving, smoothing the edge beneath her chin the same way Loretta used to do for her when she was little and afraid of thunderstorms. "Don't rush home," her mother had whispered then, voice thin, breath catching halfway through the sentence. "I'll be fine till morning." Naomi had smiled because mothers were allowed to lie like that. Daughters weren't. By the time she stood in Grant Holloway's kitchen with that prescription in her hand, she had already sold the last decent thing she owned. A pair of small gold earrings her mother gave her when she turned 18. The pawn shop barely looked at them before sliding a few wrinkled bills across the counter. It still wasn't enough. That was the part Naomi hated most. Not being poor. She had survived poor her whole life. It was the math of desperation that wore her down. The way every crisis came down to some impossible little number standing between life and relief. $40, $78, $83. Tonight, it was $83 and one man's decision. And Naomi knew the danger of putting your survival in someone else's hands. She knew what it did to your voice, your posture, the way shame could creep into your bones and make you smaller if you let it. So when she asked Grant for help, she made sure to stand straight. She kept her chin up. She didn't cry. She didn't plead. Because if this night broke her, she would not let it do so in front of people who had never had to choose between medicine and rent. Still, as she stood there under those white kitchen lights, with the prescription softening in her palm and the memory of her mother's breathing still lodged in her chest, Naomi knew one thing with terrifying clarity. If she walked out of that house empty-handed, she might be going home to a woman who would not survive until sunrise. Grant Holloway lived inside the kind of silence money builds for itself. His house sat above the city like it had been designed to avoid ever touching the world below it. All glass, stone, and cold symmetry, with lights that dimmed automatically and floors polished enough to reflect people back at themselves before they ever spoke. Everything about the place was controlled. The temperature never changed. The staff moved in quiet patterns. Even the air smelled expensive. Cedar, leather, and whatever florist came each Thursday to replace arrangements no one really looked at. Grant fit the house too well. He was the kind of white man people softened around without realizing it, the kind whose last name opened doors before he even reached them. At 42, he carried wealth the way some men carried old injuries. Permanently, instinctively, like something that had shaped his posture and hardened his instincts. He wasn't loud. That would have made him easier to understand. He rarely raised his voice, rarely repeated himself, and almost never explained his decisions. That was worse. Men like Grant didn't need volume. They had structure, influence, reputation. Entire rooms adjusted around the smallest shift in their mood. Naomi had seen it happen too many times to count. Investors leaned in when he spoke. Assistants straightened when he walked by. Guests laughed a second too quickly at things that weren't funny. Even in his own kitchen, wearing no tie and with one button open at the collar, he still looked like authority. But what made Grant truly dangerous wasn't his money. It was the way he had trained himself to treat need like contamination. Naomi had heard enough over the years, not because he confided in staff, but because rich men forgot that walls didn't stop sound and service doors often opened at the wrong time. A brother who borrowed and disappeared. A fiancé who left with more than jewelry. Former employees who had sold stories, forged invoices, stolen from the pantry and the safe. Somewhere along the way, Grant had built a religion out of mistrust. In his world, vulnerability was always a setup. Tears were leverage. Hard luck was usually a performance waiting for the right audience. He didn't see desperation and think help. He saw a test, a trap, a hand reaching into his life with a rehearsed excuse. And people let him think that way because it was easier than challenging him. Easier to call him guarded than cruel. Easier to admire his discipline than admit how much damage it did to anyone beneath him. Naomi had felt that distance from the day she started working there. Grant never learned the staff's birthdays. Never asked follow-up questions. Never said anything overtly hateful. Never gave anyone a scene dramatic enough to justify quitting on principle. What he did instead was colder. He made hierarchy feel natural, permanent. The help remained in the background and he remained untouched by whatever storms they carried in with them. That was why Naomi's question in the kitchen had landed like a violation. Not because she asked for much. $83 would have disappeared in his life without leaving a mark. It was because she had brought real human need into a space he preferred to keep sterile. For one brief moment, she had forced him to see her as more than a uniform moving through his house. And men like Grant Holloway did not like being forced to see what they had spent years learning to ignore. So when he looked at Naomi across that marble island, at the wrinkled prescription in her hand and the fear she was trying so hard not to show, something in his face sharpened instead of softened. Because to him, she wasn't a daughter trying to keep her mother alive. She was another person asking him to believe in a story. And belief, in Grant Holloway's world, was the one thing he never gave away for free. "I'll pay you back." Naomi said it one more time, not louder, just steadier. Like if she kept her voice calm enough, Maybe the humiliation wouldn't swallow her whole. The prescription was still in her hand, folded once, then again, until the paper had softened at the edges. Across the marble island, Grant Holloway looked at her the way men looked at messes they had no intention of cleaning. "That's not how this works," he said, his tone even almost bored. "You're here to do a job, Miss Ellison, not bring your personal emergencies into my home." The words didn't echo, but they hit harder than if he had raised his voice. One of the line cooks lowered his eyes. The older housekeeper by the pantry shifted her weight and said nothing. Naomi felt every pair of silent eyes in that kitchen turn away from her at once. That was the cruelest part of public humiliation. Not the insult itself, but the way people abandoned you to survive it. She could have argued. She could have told him the truth in uglier detail. That her mother's breathing had changed. That she'd already called 3 pharmacies. That $83 stood between them and an ambulance they couldn't afford. But something in Grant's face told her none of that would matter. He had already decided what kind of woman she was the second she asked. So Naomi nodded once, even though her throat had tightened. "I understand, sir." That was all she gave him. No tears, no scene, just dignity, pressed flat and bleeding quietly beneath the skin. She turned, tucked the prescription into her apron pocket, and started toward the service hallway. Her shift should have ended 20 minutes earlier. Her feet ached. Her bus card had less than $4 left on it. And all she could think about was the image of her mother alone in that apartment, waiting for medicine that was not coming. Naomi had almost reached the back corridor when she heard it. A sharp crash, then a low, strangled gasp. Not from the dining room. Not from the front of the house. From behind her. She spun just in time to see Mrs. Evelyn Pierce, the 68-year-old housekeeper who had worked for the Holloways longer than most of the furniture had, collapse beside the pantry door. The tray in her hands hit the tile first, then her knees, then the rest of her. The sound cracked through the kitchen like dropped porcelain. For one suspended second, no one moved. Then voices burst at once. "Oh my God! Mrs. Pierce! Somebody call!" But panic made people stupid. They hovered, reached halfway, backed up. Naomi dropped everything and ran. She hit the floor beside Evelyn just as the older woman's body tilted sideways. "Don't move her!" Naomi snapped, sharper than anyone there had ever heard her speak. Her knees slammed into the tile. The cold shot through her stockings, but she barely felt it. Evelyn's face had gone gray under the fluorescent light. Her breathing was shallow, quick, wrong. Naomi slid one hand behind the woman's shoulders just enough to keep her from striking the cabinet edge, then looked up. "Call 911. Now." No one moved fast enough. "Now," she shouted, and this time someone obeyed. The sous chef grabbed the phone. Naomi pulled off the knit scarf looped around her neck and folded it under Evelyn's head. "Mrs. Pierce, stay with me, okay?" Evelyn's eyelids fluttered. Her mouth moved, but the words came out thin and broken. Naomi leaned closer, forcing calm into her own breathing even as her heart slammed against her ribs. "Look at me," she whispered. "Don't close your eyes. Stay with me." She knew this rhythm. Not from medical school, not from training manuals, but from real-life buses, clinics, crowded waiting rooms, the kind of places where poor people learn to recognize emergencies before help ever arrived. She had done this once before with her mother in a pharmacy parking lot. That same cold, helpless fear was trying to claw its way up her throat now. But fear could come later. Right now, she needed Evelyn awake. "Can you squeeze my hand?" Naomi asked. A weak pressure answered her. "Good. That's good. Keep doing that." Footsteps approached fast behind her, then stopped. Grant. Naomi didn't have to look up to know he was there. She felt the change in the room before she saw him, the silence pulling tight, the staff parting slightly around his presence. "What happened?" he asked. His voice was controlled, but there was a crack beneath it now. Not panic. Disruption. Naomi glanced up only once. He was standing at the edge of the scene in that black coat, drink forgotten, eyes fixed on Evelyn on the floor, and then on Naomi's hand bracing the older woman's shoulder. "She collapsed," Naomi said. She needs room and air. Tell them to back up. It wasn't a request. It was an instruction. For a heartbeat, the kitchen went still for an entirely different reason. Naomi Ellison, the maid he had just reduced to an inconvenience, was now telling Grant Holloway what to do in his own house. And he listened. "Back up," he said immediately, sharper than before. The staff stepped away. Naomi focused on Evelyn again. "Good," she whispered. "You're okay. Ambulance is coming." Evelyn's breathing hitched. Naomi took the woman's hand in both of hers, rubbing warmth into the paper-thin skin. Her own apron was damp now from spilled water and sweat. Her bus was gone. Her mother was still alone. The prescription still sat useless in her pocket. But she stayed where she was, kneeling on expensive tile with aching knees and no guarantee anyone would ever do the same for her. Because that was the thing Grant Holloway and people like him never seemed to understand. Kindness from women like Naomi was rarely given because life had been kind to them. It was given in spite of that. The paramedics arrived 8 minutes later, though it felt like 40. They moved quickly, efficiently, asking questions Naomi answered before anyone else could. Had Evelyn hit her head? No. Was she conscious the whole time? Mostly. Any history of heart trouble? Blood pressure, Evelyn whispered weakly, and Naomi repeated it louder. The medics lifted her onto the stretcher. One of them gave Naomi a short nod that felt almost like respect. Then they wheeled Evelyn toward the side entrance. The kitchen was left in erect silence. Broken glass swept to the corners. A wet towel abandoned near the sink. Everyone looking anywhere but at Naomi. She rose slowly, one hand pressing against the ache in her knees. Her scarf was gone. Her apron was stained. Her body suddenly remembered how tired it was. She turned to leave before anyone could stop her, but Grant's voice caught her halfway to the hallway. "Miss Ellison." Naomi stopped. She didn't turn right away. The service lights hummed overhead. Rain tapped faintly against the far window. When she finally faced him, Grant was standing alone now near the island, his expression unreadable. For one impossible second, Naomi thought he might say it, might apologize, might reach into his pocket, take out his wallet, and undo the cruelty of 10 minutes earlier with something as simple as mercy. But Grant Holloway was still Grant Holloway. "You can go," he said. That was it. Not thank you. Not are you all right. Not what about your mother. Just permission to disappear again. Naomi held his gaze for one beat longer than she should have. Then she nodded once, because if she spoke now, the wrong thing might come out. She turned and walked toward the back exit with her wet apron clinging to her legs and her mother's empty prescription pressing against her hip like a bruise. Behind her, the Holloway house returned to order. Footsteps, whispers, someone restarting the dishwasher, someone else wiping the floor where Evelyn had fallen. But Grant didn't move right away. He stood there in the white kitchen light, staring at the dark service hallway Naomi had just vanished into, and for the first time that night, something about the silence in his house no longer felt clean. The rain had already soaked through Naomi Ellison's shoes by the time she reached the bus stop, and the digital sign above it blinked a single, useless word, delayed, before going dark completely. She stood there for a second longer than she should have, breath uneven, fingers pressing against the folded prescription in her pocket like she could somehow force it to become something more than paper. Then she turned and started walking. The city felt different at that hour, quieter, colder, less forgiving. Storefronts shuttered. Sidewalks empty except for the occasional car cutting through puddles too fast. Naomi kept her head down, counting blocks instead of minutes, because time had already betrayed her. Every step home stretched the distance between her and the one thing she couldn't afford to lose. By the time she reached her building, her legs were trembling. Not from the walk, but from what she might find waiting upstairs. The hallway light flickered once as she pushed the door open. The smell hit her first. Damp walls, old heat, and something sharper underneath. She didn't take off her shoes, didn't dry her hair. She went straight to the bedroom. "Mama!" Her voice was soft, but it cracked anyway. No answer. Naomi's chest tightened instantly. She crossed the room in 2 quick steps. Loretta Ellison was still in the bed, But something had changed. Her chest rose too fast, too shallow. Her lips had gone pale. One hand gripped the blanket like she had tried to hold on to something that wasn't there. Hey, I'm here, Naomi said quickly, dropping to her knees beside the bed. Her hands moved without thinking, adjusting the pillow, brushing damp hair from her mother's forehead, checking her pulse with fingers that felt suddenly too cold to be steady. You're okay, I'm here. But her voice didn't believe it. Loretta's eyes opened halfway, unfocused, searching. Naomi? Yeah, Mama, I'm here. Naomi leaned closer, forcing a smile that trembled at the edges. I'm right here. Her mother tried to breathe deeper, but it caught halfway, turning into a weak, broken cough that made her whole body shake. Naomi's heart slammed hard enough to hurt. This wasn't the manageable kind. This wasn't something tea or rest could carry through the night. This was the edge. Naomi reached for the small plastic bottle on the nightstand, empty. Completely empty. She stared at it for half a second too long, like maybe she had missed something, like maybe shaking it would produce one last dose. Nothing. The room felt smaller all at once. The air heavier. Naomi grabbed her phone, hands slipping once before she got a grip. She opened the emergency call screen and froze, because she knew what came after that call. Sirens. Questions. Bills she could not pay. Choices she could not undo. Her thumb hovered over the button. Her mother's breathing hitched again, sharper this time. Naomi? I'm here, she said again, faster now. I'm not going anywhere. But that wasn't true, because standing still was no longer an option. Naomi lowered the phone slowly, her jaw tightening as a different kind of decision formed. One that scared her more than debt. She stood up so fast the chair beside the bed scraped loudly against the floor. Stay with me, she whispered, pulling the blanket higher around Loretta's chest. Just stay with me. Then she turned and ran, back out into the hallway, down the stairs 2 at a time, back into the rain. Because if the world wasn't going to meet her halfway, she was done asking it to. The pharmacy 3 blocks down had a metal shutter halfway pulled. The lights inside dimmed. Naomi slammed her hand against the glass anyway. Please, she called out, breath fogging the surface. Please, I just need. The man inside looked up, startled, then shook his head immediately, mouthing something she couldn't hear through the door. Closed. Naomi hit the glass again, harder this time. She's not breathing right. I have the prescription. I can pay later. Please. The man hesitated for half a second, then pointed to the sign and turned away. Naomi stood there, chest rising and falling too fast, the world narrowing down to that locked door and the sound of her own pulse. Then she backed away slowly, shaking her head once like she could reject the reality in front of her. Okay, she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Another option. There had to be another option. But there wasn't. Not anymore. Not tonight. Naomi turned back toward the street, rain sliding down her face, mixing with something warmer she refused to acknowledge. And in that moment, standing alone under a flickering streetlight, soaked, exhausted, with nothing left to sell, no one left to ask, and time running out, Naomi Ellison realized the truth that hurt more than anything Grant Holloway had said. She had done everything right. She had worked. She had endured. She had asked with dignity. And still, it wasn't enough. She looked down at the prescription one last time, the ink smudged slightly now from the rain. $83. That was all it had ever been. $83 between her and losing the only person she had left. Naomi closed her eyes for 1 second, just one, then turned back toward her apartment, already bracing herself for what she might walk into. Because this time, there would be no more asking. And whatever happened next, she would have to face it alone. By the time Naomi made it back upstairs, the apartment had gone so quiet it frightened her more than the coughing had. She pushed the door open too fast, her wet sleeve catching on the knob, and stood there for 1 suspended second listening. The radiator clicked once in the corner. Water dripped steadily from the hem of her coat onto the worn linoleum. From the bedroom, She could hear it. Not silence exactly, but something thinner, more fragile. The sound of a body trying not to fail. Naomi crossed the room slowly this time, like moving too fast might break whatever was still holding the night together. The lamp beside the bed was on, casting a weak amber circle over the blanket and the glass of untouched water on the nightstand. Loretta's eyes were closed. Her breathing came shallow and uneven, each inhale dragging in just enough air to make the next one possible. Naomi sat down carefully on the edge of the mattress and pressed the back of her fingers to her mother's forehead. Warm. Too warm. "Hey, Mama," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if Loretta could hear her. "I'm back." Loretta didn't answer, but her fingers shifted faintly against the blanket, as if the sound of Naomi's voice had reached somewhere deeper than sleep. Naomi swallowed hard and reached for the washcloth in the chipped ceramic bowl beside the bed. The water had gone lukewarm. She wrung the cloth out anyway and laid it gently across her mother's chest, then adjusted the blanket around her shoulders with slow, practiced hands. She had done this so many nights it had become a language of its own. Cloth, pillow, glass, breath, listen. There was no room left for panic in motions like that. Panic made your hands useless. Love made them steady. Outside, the rain tapped softly against the window unit, then harder, then soft again. Somewhere down on the street, a siren wailed and faded. Naomi looked toward the prescription still folded in her hand, then set it face down on the table beside the empty medicine bottle. She didn't want to see the number anymore. Didn't want to give $83 the power to define this room. Not tonight. She reached for her mother's hand instead. Loretta's skin felt thinner than it used to, almost papery, but the warmth was still there. Naomi held it between both of hers and lowered her head for just a second until her forehead nearly touched the blanket. She wasn't praying exactly. She had run out of clean prayers months ago. This was something smaller, more tired, more honest. Just a daughter trying to keep her fear from becoming visible. "Morning's coming," she whispered after a while, though the room beyond the curtains was still black. "You just have to stay with me till morning." The lie hung there between them, soft and desperate. Naomi stared at the wall clock above the dresser. 11:17 p.m. The second hand moved with a tiny, relentless tick that made the whole room feel crueler somehow. She could hear every second they did not have. Her own breathing had begun to match the rhythm of her mother's without her noticing, shallow, careful, waiting for the next rise of the chest. She forced herself to inhale deeper. The air in the room smelled faintly of steam, old fabric, and eucalyptus oil rubbed into blankets too many times to count. It smelled like survival trying its best. Naomi leaned back slightly and brushed her thumb over the ridge of her mother's knuckles. In the low light, Loretta looked smaller than she had that morning. Smaller than she had any right to be. It made something inside Naomi ache in a place too deep for tears, because this was the part no one ever saw. Not Grant Holloway. Not the people in his white kitchen. Not the man behind the pharmacy glass. They saw the request, the inconvenience, the moment of asking. They never saw what came after, the waiting, the listening, the terrible intimacy of loving someone through a night that might take them. Naomi closed her eyes for one breath, then opened them again. She could not afford to drift. She reached for the damp washcloth once more, re-wetted in the bowl, and laid it across her mother's wrists this time. Then she sat back down, pulled the chair closer, and stayed there with her hand wrapped around Loretta's until the room settled into that painful, suspended stillness only the truly helpless ever understand. 11:42 p.m. Then 11:51. Then 11:57. And just when the night had gone so still Naomi could hear the hum of the hallway light outside her door. There came a sound from downstairs. Not thunder. Not a siren. The low, unmistakable purr of an expensive engine idling in the rain. The engine didn't turn off right away. It idled low and steady beneath the rain, too smooth, too controlled to belong to anything in this neighborhood. Naomi didn't move at first. Her hand was still wrapped around her mother's, her body locked in that fragile balance between hope and fear. Then the headlights swept across the thin curtains, white light cutting through the room for a brief second before settling outside. Naomi's breath caught. No one came here at this hour. Not for them. Never for them. Another sound followed, a car door opening, then closing with a soft, expensive weight. Footsteps on wet pavement. Slow. Direct. Naomi stood up before she realized she had decided to. Her chair scraped lightly against the floor, but she didn't look back. She moved toward the front door, each step tightening something in her chest. This wasn't relief yet. It was interruption. And interruptions at this hour didn't come with guarantees. The knock came once. Firm. Not loud. Just certain. Naomi stopped inches from the door, her hand hovering over the handle. For a brief second, every version of the night collided in her mind. Debt collectors, police, neighbors complaining about noise, the landlord. None of them made sense. And yet something deeper told her this was none of those. She opened the door. Grant Holloway stood there in the rain. No coat this time. Just a dark shirt, damp at the shoulders, hair slightly undone like he hadn't checked a mirror before leaving. Behind him, a black car idled at the curb, its lights cutting through the street like something out of place. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Naomi's first instinct wasn't gratitude. It was disbelief, because men like him didn't come back. Not after drawing a line. Not after deciding who you were. Grant looked at her. Not past her, not through her, at her. His eyes moved once, taking in the hallway behind her. The dim light, the worn walls. Something in his expression shifted, subtle but real. "Where is she?" he asked. No explanation. No apology yet. Just urgency. Naomi didn't answer immediately. She studied him like she was trying to understand whether this was real or just another form of disappointment waiting to unfold. Rain slid from his sleeve onto the floor between them. His breathing was slightly uneven, like he hadn't taken time to slow it down. He had come fast. That much was clear. Behind him, another door opened from the car. A man stepped out, older, composed, carrying a small medical bag. Not a driver. Not security. Naomi's grip tightened slightly on the doorframe. That was when it shifted. Not because of what Grant said, but because of what he brought. He hadn't come to talk. He had come to act. Naomi stepped aside, just enough to let them pass. No words. Grant moved immediately, the doctor following close behind. The apartment seemed even smaller now, forced to contain a world it was never built for. Grant paused only once at the edge of the bedroom, his eyes landing on Loretta in the bed, the shallow rise of her chest, the damp cloths, the empty bottle on the table, the prescription beside it. He saw everything in one glance. And this time, there was no misjudgment left. No room for doubt. Only consequence. The doctor moved forward, already opening his bag, already asking questions. Naomi answered without hesitation. How long had she been like this? Had she taken anything recently? Any history? Naomi's voice was steady now, focused, because this part she understood. This part she could control. Grant stayed back half a step, watching, absorbing, standing in a space he had never occupied before. Not as owner, not as authority, but as the man who had almost walked away from this. His jaw tightened once. Then he spoke, quieter than before. I should have listened. It wasn't said to the room. Not to the doctor. Not even fully to Naomi. It was said to the version of himself from earlier that night. The one who had looked at her and seen inconvenience instead of truth. Naomi didn't respond. Not yet. Because redemption didn't happen in words. Not in rooms like this. It happened in time. In action. In whether her mother's breathing would steady or not. The doctor worked quickly, efficient and calm, preparing medication, checking vitals, issuing instructions in a low, controlled tone. Naomi moved where he needed her to, handing over items, adjusting pillows, staying present. Grant remained near the doorway, out of the way, but not leaving. Not this time. And as the minutes passed, as the air in the room shifted from panic to something more fragile, more possible, one truth settled between them with quiet, undeniable weight. Naomi Ellison had asked for help, and been denied. And still, she had chosen to help someone else first. And that was the thing Grant Holloway could not walk away from. Not anymore. The medicine worked slowly, almost cruelly slowly. But it worked. Not like in movies, not all at once. Not with some dramatic gasp that made everything instantly okay. Loretta's breathing didn't transform. It eased. One jagged inhale at a time, then another, until the space between each breath stopped sounding like a cliff edge. Naomi stayed beside the bed through all of it, one hand around her mother's wrist, the other pressed against the blanket like she could physically keep her anchored to the mattress. The doctor adjusted the oxygen support, checked her pulse again, then finally looked up with the first expression all night that wasn't urgent. She should stabilize, he said quietly. But she needs proper treatment in the morning. No delays. Naomi nodded once, though her throat had gone too tight for words. Across the room, Grant Holloway let out a breath so low Naomi almost missed it. It sounded less like relief and more like something heavier, like a man realizing how close he had come to becoming unforgivable. The doctor packed his things with efficient calm, then scribbled instructions on the back of an envelope and handed Naomi a small paper pharmacy packet for the next few hours. This should carry her through until admission, he said. I'll call ahead. Naomi took it carefully, as if the packet itself were breakable. Thank you, she whispered. The doctor gave her a small nod and stepped into the kitchen to make a call. That left only the two of them in the room, with the low hum of borrowed medical equipment and the soft, mechanical hiss of assisted air between them. Grant didn't move toward her right away. He stood near the doorway, hands empty now, shoulders still carrying rain that had long since dried into the fabric of his shirt. He looked out of place in that room. Too polished for the chipped paint, too expensive for the cracked nightstand, too untouched for the kind of fear that had lived there all evening. And yet, for the first time since Naomi had known him, he didn't seem larger than the room. If anything, he seemed diminished by it. You should have fired me, Naomi said at last, her voice low, eyes still on her mother. Grant's head lifted slightly. What? She swallowed once. Back there. In your kitchen. After I raised my voice. After I told everyone to move. There was no accusation in it. Just truth. The kind that didn't need decoration. You could have had me escorted out. Grant looked at her for a long second before answering. I almost let your mother die over $83. The words landed harder than an apology would have. Naomi finally turned her head and looked at him fully. There was no defensiveness in his face. No instinct to soften it. No attempt to excuse it with stress or misunderstanding or the language powerful people usually hid behind when they were ashamed. Just the truth. Standing there in a dark shirt and silence. I was wrong, he said. And not in the way men like me usually mean when we say that. Naomi held his gaze, searching for performance and finding none. That was what unsettled her most. If he had come in arrogant, if he had thrown money at the room and acted like rescue erased cruelty, she would have known what to do with him. But this version, the quiet one, the one who looked like he had seen something in himself he didn't like, was harder to stand against. Grant reached into his pocket slowly, then set something on the dresser beside the lamp. Not cash. Not a stack of bills. A card. Hospital admissions. Specialist care. Full coverage. Naomi stared at it but didn't touch it. This isn't charity, he said, reading the hesitation in her face. It's responsibility. Her eyes flicked back to him. Why? The question came out before she could stop it. Small. Raw. Dangerous. Why had he come back? Why had he believed now? Why had a man who could ignore entire lives suddenly chosen not to ignore hers? Grant looked past her for half a second, toward Loretta in the bed, then toward the damp scarf still folded under the kitchen chair where Naomi had dropped it when she ran to the door. Mrs. Pierce woke up in the ambulance, he said quietly. She told the paramedics the only reason she didn't hit her head was because you caught her. Naomi said nothing. Then she told me, he continued, that before she blacked out, she heard you asking me for help. His jaw tightened once. She said you were begging for your mother, and still ran to save her first. The room went still again, But this time it wasn't with fear. It was with recognition. Grant took one slow step closer, but no more than that. "I've spent years convincing myself that everyone wants something from me," he said. "And maybe that's true often enough to make a man stupid. But you—" He stopped there, the sentence unfinished, because something sounded false if pushed too far. Naomi looked down at Loretta's hand still resting in hers. Her mother's breathing had steadied into something softer now, weaker than healthy but no longer terrifying. For the first time all night, Naomi let herself feel the edge of what had almost happened. It came not as tears, but as exhaustion so deep it made her bones feel hollow. "I meant it," she said after a while, voice barely above a whisper. "I would have paid you back." Grant's expression shifted. Not pity, not amusement. Something closer to grief. "That," he said quietly, "is exactly why I should have listened the first time." Naomi looked at him again. The man in front of her was still Grant Holloway. Still white, still rich, still from a world that had taught itself not to see women like her until they were useful, extraordinary, or dying. That didn't vanish in one night, but something had cracked. And sometimes, that was where change actually started. Not in speeches, not in grand gestures, in shame, in witnessing, in showing up after failing and not asking to be praised for it. The doctor returned a moment later, giving Naomi discharge instructions for the morning and a hospital name downtown that would be expecting them. Grant took the paper from him, read it once, then folded it neatly and handed it back to Naomi with more care than he had shown her all year. "I'll have a car here at 7, he said. "If you still want it." Naomi studied him for one beat longer than comfort allowed. Then, without smiling, without softening the reality of what had passed between them, she gave a small nod. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was the first thing that could ever lead there. And in that little room above the laundromat, with rain still slipping down the window and the worst of the night finally loosening its grip, that was enough. Dawn arrived quietly, as if the city itself had decided not to disturb what had survived the night. The rain had stopped. Pale light crept through the thin curtains and settled across the room in soft gray bands. Over the chipped dresser, the empty medicine bottle, the folded blanket at the foot of the bed. Loretta Ellison was asleep now, her breathing still fragile, but steady enough to let the silence feel different. Not cruel, just tired. Naomi sat beside her with both hands wrapped around a paper cup gone lukewarm hours ago. Her body bent slightly forward from the kind of exhaustion that had no dramatic shape to it. Across the room, Grant Holloway stood near the window with his sleeves rolled once at the forearms, staring out at a neighborhood he had probably never imagined entering before tonight. The doctor was gone. The machine hummed softly. Somewhere downstairs, a delivery truck rattled past and faded into morning. Naomi finally rose and adjusted the blanket around her mother's shoulders one last time. When she turned, Grant was already looking at her. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't cheapen it. Naomi walked past him slowly, then paused at the kitchen doorway, one hand resting against the frame. "Thank you," she said, almost too quietly to hear. Grant lowered his eyes for a moment, then gave the smallest nod. Outside, the first real sunlight touched the wet pavement below. Inside, the room stayed still. And in that stillness, what remained wasn't romance, or rescue, or even forgiveness. It was something quieter. A woman who had kept her dignity when the world gave her no reason to. A man who had finally learned that mercy offered late still mattered, if it truly arrived. And on the night Naomi Ellison thought she was about to lose everything, the one thing that came back before morning was humanity.